10 years ago, he introduced to the small screen a fictional Baltimore that remains entangled in the imagination of this city. How many of you have found yourselves in one neighborhood or another, looking up at a corner or a stretch of row homes or a storefront and thinking about a scene or a bit of dialogue or a character from The Wire? For better or worse, The Wire is part of the city now. It's conspicuously good television for many reasons, but I'd single out one here. The show's creators had a clear moral aim: to dramatize with indelible characters what was dangerously perverse about the city's institutions and economic order. In this respect, and in its complexity and deterministic vision, the project calls to mind the accomplishments of progressive-era novelists like Frank Norris and Theodore Dreiser, writers who channeled moral outrage and sympathy into big urban books that exposed the injustices of the age. In 1903, Dreiser wrote, "The sum and substance of literary as well as social morality may be expressed in 3 words: tell the truth. It matters not how the tongues of the critics may wag, or the voices of a partially developed and highly conventionalized society may complain. The business of the author, as well as of other workers upon this earth, is to say what he knows to be true, and having said as much, to abide the result with patience." Well, I don't know if Mr. Simon can be described as a patient man, and not everyone in this town may agree with his truth-telling. But I would say that he has, in his writing and television work, been living up to the challenge of literary morality as Dreiser describes it. As was the case for Dreiser and Norris, David Simon's creative work began with a career in journalism. For 13 years, he reported for the Baltimore Sun. He then wrote 2 books of nonfiction: Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets, and The Corner, A Year in the Life of an Inner-City Neighborhood. Titles that launched him into show business. Homicide aired on NBC, and The Corner became an HBO miniseries. Simon is also the creator, writer, and executive producer of Generation Kill and Treme, a program about post-Katrina New Orleans, now airing on HBO. But here in Baltimore, of course, he is best known for The Wire, which aired for 5 seasons beginning in 2002. It is a unique, troubling, unforgettable work of art, and I'm pleased to introduce you now to its creator, David Simon.
Thank you. I know this room pretty well. We had a couple of our rap parties and our premieres. Not rap parties, our premieres in this room. So I know it pretty well, and I'm not afraid of it. It's good to be back in Baltimore. New Orleans is a wonderful place. It has its own peculiarities and sensibilities, but there is something about coming home. Without this event, which Mica was very kind to put on, I don't think I would have remembered that it was 10 years since the Wire premiered. Doesn't seem that long. I was fairly sure that we weren't going to get to finish the show when we started. I think in some ways we did everything possible not to finish the show, and yet somehow we managed to get through it. The short answer of how it happened is that we resolutely didn't know what we were doing. By that I mean we didn't know how to make a television show that people would watch right away. I think I've proved over the last decade or so that I consistently can make television shows that people won't watch right away. But just a couple of days ago, I got sent a packet of stats from HBO about DVD sales on all the projects, and a lot of them are The Wire is accelerating. It sold some ungodly amount of DVDs in the last quarter that it had never sold before. And We've been off the air for 4 years. Generation Kill is now starting to sell at an increased rate. That thing's been off the air for 4 years. It was just a miniseries. So something happened in television that allowed for storytelling of a kind that that couldn't exist before. And by that I mean television was about immediacy, and it was about the water cooler. It was about what you watched last night, and it was about appointment television. Get them to tune in now to this. Don't let them go away. Have a big scene before the commercial break so they'll come back. There were certain things you had to do to write for it that mitigated against it telling a serious story. You needed to become, as a television writer, hyperbolic. You needed to become over-dramatized or excessively funny if you were writing for comedy. And that's not to say there wasn't a skill set in an art. There was an incredible skill set, but it didn't necessarily lend itself to speaking about the world as it is. Why not? Well, because the important things were the ads. They had to sell you something every 13, 14 minutes. In fact, they had to sell you a lot of stuff, and they had to charge the advertisers at a rate that would maximize their profit. That was the model. That was the economic model of the most fundamental American entertainment medium of the 20th century, which was the program was stuff you wrapped around the ads. And so to have a program that told you that our political and social framework was being undercut, that poverty was becoming resistant to all the forces you might array against it, that we were becoming a divided people, that there was another America that was very different from yours. These are all things that won't make you buy the new Lincoln Continentals or the new iPads, or this will unnerve you before those commercials come on. So you weren't going to get very far, and you weren't going to get very far also because a lot of people won't sit still for that. Only a minority of people will sit still for that, and then maybe years and years later, after enough people have chewed on their ear about how they should be watching this show, they'll get a box set of the DVDs and they'll stick them in and they'll start watching, and they might have a little bit greater toleration than they did for it on a Sunday night where they needed to get up for work on a Monday morning. They'll watch it in their own sweet time. And at that point, something weird happened, which is The Wire started to find its place. None of that was a plan. DVD box sets didn't exist as a serious marketing tool. DVDs did, but DVD box sets of television were something that HBO mastered only partway into our run. You guys won't remember this, but there were no DVDs of The Wire until season 3 was already on the air. We weren't regarded, they were trying like hell to keep The Sopranos in the stores, but nobody actually got the season 1 DVDs of the show out until season 3. It was a systems failure. Just nobody saw much of a market there. And for those of you that remember, everyone now speaks of The Wire as a fait accompli. It's sui generis. It just exists. It has its sort of place in the TV firmament to the extent that people write about it and talk about it. At the time, it was really lonely. Nobody was watching the show on Sunday nights. Our numbers peaked in season 2 and went down every season thereafter. And the critics didn't show up. Some of them never showed up. Some of the high-end critics never showed up until afterwards, and then they would write about it as if they'd known all along. But they had never written, I don't want to name names or sound like a bitter person, but Nancy Franklin in the New Yorker. We waited season after season. Maybe this year the New Yorker will notice. She showed up in time to trash Generation Kill, but never wrote a word about The Wire. So we were, and these things mattered because we were really counting on word of mouth from critics to sell us because we realized we were in for a long haul. And some critics really did champion the show and tried to get in early. And I guess by the end of second season, we started hearing from people who realized we were building something a little different. But the real word of mouth was just regular people. Turns out there was an audience that didn't want to be placated and amused to death and titillated and watched women with low cleavage and things that blow up real good, and other people shooting people all the time. They were okay with the idea of a story being detailed and ornate and argumentative and maybe a little bit dark. And those people talked to other people of like mind, and pretty soon something happened. The other thing that we didn't really know about, I didn't know about, thank God I got with some people who did, I didn't know about how to make film. I don't have any film training. My training is in journalism. And I had read well enough about the city and about things like race and the drug war and Ed Burns and the other people who were essential to the show. When I use the we, it's not a royal we, it's a we. The Wire was the work of a lot of people working together and arguing. And the arguments made it better. And Ed is a very forceful person, to any of you who know him, and essential to the story of The Wire. But he had policed the city and done so at a very high level. And I'd covered Baltimore, and Bill Zorzi had covered politics. And the other novelists we got to write for us had been working in narrative form, doing inner city stories. They weren't writing about the parts of the cities that normally get written about. It was Richard Price writing about, not about Manhattan, but about the cities across the river that were hard bitten back in the 80s and 90s, Jersey City and such, or Dorchester in Boston for Lahane, or Northeast Washington, not Northwest for Pelicanos. And what we did was we argued all the time. Something that used to happen in my newsroom, and something that I had long started to miss even before I started to contemplate my departure from the Sun. I love arguing. I get a lot of ribbing for being an angry person, and I don't feel particularly angry. I came up in a house where argument was sport, and nobody really took it personally. Both of my parents disagreed with each other politically. One was a lefty, and the other one was left of the lefty. And my brother and sister had their own opinions. And you were expected to come to the table having not only read the day's events, but we took the Washington Post and the New York Times on Sunday and all the we were just, my dad was a wannabe newspaperman. And you were expected to argue from fact. And if your facts were weak, or if you misrepresented your facts, you got your head handed to you. And I remember this from a very early age. I remember it being, don't feel sorry for me. It was immensely fun. It was a wonderful way to grow up. But I found that institutionally, argument is not tolerated the way it ought to be. And at the Sun, that was true. And I found it to be, as I started to argue larger things that mattered to me, I found it to be more and more problematic. And Ed Burns found it to be problematic in the police department. Ed had very specific ideas about how to police violence in a drug-saturated area. And he had done so effectively using a series of wiretap cases that were among the best police work of his generation in Baltimore. His efforts to try to replicate that led him to some cul-de-sacs of incredible frustration in the department and speeded his departure. So we came into this this opportunity to have these hours of television with a willingness to argue with each other, with the world, with the way TV had been. It was argument to us was nothing to be afraid of, and it was nothing that we expected to take personally. It was remarkable how much of the world did take it personally, but a lot of other people were engaged by the argument, so it was ultimately worth it. Baltimore, by and large, and by Baltimore I'm not referring to the political leadership or the General Baltimore Committee or the Board of Realtors or anybody that, thinks with their own ambition first, but ordinary Baltimoreans, black, white, middle class, poor, even some affluent, were incredibly tolerant of what we were doing. I can't tell you of many problems we had filming, other than trying to convince City Hall not to throw us out after the first season. But aside from that, the average interaction that we had on the streets of this city was incredibly tolerant, and by the end, absolutely affectionate, particularly in the inner city. To see Wendell or Michael Kay or Andre come out of their trailer to work a scene, over in East or West Baltimore, and see how they were greeted by ordinary people who had finally found a television drama that regarded their lives and their America as being worthy of legitimate concern and attention. There was something incredibly empowering about that. And the camaraderie that we felt when we filmed in those neighborhoods was really supportive and something I'll never forget. I didn't know about I didn't even know, when I first showed up on the homicide set in 95 to try to learn television, I didn't take it seriously. I thought I would be going back to journalism. I thought I would learn this skill set and do this for a couple years because they happened to be filming here and because I needed to get out of the sun. And I thought, I'll finish the corner manuscript and I'll go work at another newspaper somewhere. That was my plan. And I showed up. I didn't even know that the guy standing next to the camera, turning the knob, was focusing it, that he was pulling focus. It was inconceivable to me that the guy looking through the camera wouldn't focus the camera. That's how little I knew about film. And for those of you that have studied any film, if I use the phrase crossing the line, Bob Colesbury on The Wire, this is now years into my, 2-3 years into my film career, he had to explain crossing the line to me maybe 5 times in 4 days before I started to understand it. And then I think I came back to him a month later and I needed another tutorial. I didn't know anything about film. The only thing I knew about is I thought I was a pretty good storyteller. Ed Burns turned out to be a remarkably good storyteller for somebody who'd been a working cop. The joke about police is they all have an incredible story inside them, and that's probably where it should stay. But Ed is the exception to the rule. And that we had a lot of good storytellers working on story. But how you actually translate to film was an adventure. And the late Bob Colesbury, who was with us for those first 2 seasons, has to be credited. I gave him one thing that I knew, which is I didn't want the camera to be the story. It's like I wanted the camera not to be all-knowing. I wanted the camera not to make dramatic moves. I wanted the camera not to be, it shouldn't be about the shot. It should be about the story. It should be about the world that it's capturing. You shouldn't think about the camera very much. And Bob took that to heart on The Corner and did that first, and then he did the same thing on The Wire. And it's his template, not mine, visually, that we followed and that I've continued to follow ever since. If there's a film that requires me to do something new, the director better think of it, because I know I won't. So there were lots of stuff we didn't know, but what we did know was nothing was working anymore. Drug war wasn't working. Ed had policed it for 20 years. It was only making things worse. It wasn't achieving any of its goals. And to try to bring this to anyone's attention wasn't working. I would write a long series of articles about why drug stats didn't, arrest stats didn't mean anything, why the city police were losing themselves in the drug war. And it would go into the paper, and the Sun's own editorial board would then write, there'd be a new police commissioner coming in the next week, and he'd say, we're going to take back these corners. We're going to start at Green Mountain and 21st. We're We're going to plant the flag there. And the Baltimore Sun would say, now we've got, now we're really going to fight the drug war. I mean, they would, I would stand there thinking, man, it's hard to do this with journalism. It's hard to do this with facts. People will not focus on something that is systemic. They want the bang bang. They deal in small morsels of daily coverage. But if you try to say this isn't working anymore, stand back, take a look at what we're doing to our own city. Take a look at what we're doing to each other as Americans. It's really hard to do it with fact. I find that to be very strange. I was trained as a journalist. I believe in journalism. I don't think there's any substitute for journalism. I certainly don't think television drama is a substitute for journalism. But I have to admit, I probably reached more people with an argument using The Wire than I did with years of covering the drug war. And of course, in the beginning, I was impressed by Dope on the Table, and I was impressed by the passion of cops and prosecutors, and they had pretty much assured me that crack cocaine would end all life on earth as we knew it if we didn't somehow marshal all the forces against it, and that there was no choice other than drug prohibition. And Ed, of course, had committed to the drug war for his career for 20 years, and we were ready to have an argument, and that's the part we got right. People can sit down to write a television show, and I'd like to tell you that people get around the writer's table and they say, the first thing they do, first order of business is, okay, they've given us 13, 10, 22 episodes. God bless them. Here's our budget. We now are charged with telling a story. What story do we want to tell? Why do we want to tell it? And why does it matter? I would like to tell you that those questions come up as a matter of routine in the television industry or even in the film industry. They don't. The purpose of a television showrunner is to sustain the franchise, is to run the show until you squeeze every last dollar out of it. There's just too much money in having a hit show not to do that. If they love them some Omar, give them more Omar. If they love them some Stringer, don't kill Stringer. If they want prettier women, hire prettier actresses. If they need to see something, a ticking time bomb to come back from the commercial break or to come back for the next episode Sunday night, have a ticking time bomb. And there's no denying it. It works. There's nothing like porn and violence, and I don't say that with any disrespect for porn or violence. They've gotten us a long way, and I'm sure they'll continue to be fuel for a lot of entertainment. But ultimately, we actually had an argument, and we had it in front of every single season of The Wire. Okay, what do we want to say about education? What do we want to say about political reform? What do we want to say about the death of work in America and what's happening to the middle class and the working class, and what's happening to those union wage jobs by which the underclass used to become the middle class in this country? What do we want to say? What do we want to get in there? We don't have an unlimited number of episodes. What can we afford to leave out? What must we say? And then the arguing would begin. And I'm most proud of that. There's a lot that I can look at The Wire and I see a lot of bad shot choices, and there's dialogue that I can improve on, and this performance was great, that one maybe not so much, and I can look at it sort of squinting, because when you look back on work you've already done, it's a little bit of a horror show. Don't go back, read the pages of anything you wrote. Just keep marching forward. That's my advice if you're doing stuff. But I can, when forced, when I have to sit there and watch an episode because I'm sitting in some class and they're showing clips or something, I can look at it and be tolerant of all the mistakes. The one thing I couldn't be tolerant of is if we didn't have those arguments and we didn't say what we meant to say. A lot of people acted as the wire went on as if it was all accidental, as if we had somehow figured out how to grab a little piece of the zeitgeist and act like we, knew where things were going in terms of trends, national stuff that was going to echo. It wasn't accidental in the sense that we knew what our critique was supposed to be based on those writers' meetings, based on the arguments we had. We didn't always agree, but we always reached a consensus. Or if we didn't reach a consensus, we kept arguing right up until the time when the camera was shooting. And I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of that. Those are the arguments that were supposed to happen in my newsroom and had stopped happening. Through the insecurities of editors, through the desire to shape the facts to fit a prize-winning story, through the low cunning of ambition that marked the last days of the great newspapers in America. There was something really disappointing. When I went into journalism, I went in as a believer. I stayed a believer for a long time. And I have great affection for the Baltimore Sun. It raised me from a pup. I went there, I was 22 years old, right out of college. And I didn't leave until I was 35. And those years really, I have some wonderful memories. But it's heartbreaking to me what was conceded by newspapers in terms of their ambition, in terms of what they perceived as their role. And then ultimately they were ripe for the internet to just knock them over. They were as thin as a feather. There was nothing there, or very little there, when the internet came calling. Instead of making it stronger, they had not. So I'm really proud that we used this little short of HBO, and thanks to HBO, they left us alone. The joke was, after the pilot, we were never really visited by a senior HBO executive for the entire run of the show. The joke was that their plane would have to be on the way from LA to Paris and crash in Baltimore for them to visit the Wire set. You want to not be bothered by network people, film in Baltimore. I've seen more people in New Orleans in the last couple of years than in the whole run of the Wire, usually around Jazz Fest or Mardi Gras time. But I'm really proud of the argument, and I'm proud that we stayed true to that, and that's why the Wire, I think, has a little bit of staying power. We didn't anticipate how hollow the American experiment had become in a lot of ways. We're not prescient. We didn't see something as grandiose as the mortgage bubble. The idea of the incredible notion that whole sectors of Wall Street would, take shit in their hands and look at it and call it gold, and then convince other sectors of Wall Street and major financial institutions in other countries to call shit gold, to the point where they would wreck the world economy. We couldn't conceive of anything as grandiose, but we could right from the context of Enron and WorldCom, which was happening when we were working on the pilot, and the Catholic Church scandal, and the way in which institutions become self-aggrandizing and self-preserving, and the way in which the Orwellian speak of politicians manages to obscure the fact that there is no progress, and make it seem as if there is progress. I'd had a 13-year bite of the drug war, and Ed certainly had a 13-year bite of it, and that was a perfect allegory for discussing a nation state that no longer can recognize its own problems, much less consolidate national will and solve any of them. And Bill had covered politics, and Ed had a 7-year tour of the Baltimore school system and watched the implementation of the beginnings of No Child Left Behind, the idea of test scores being a measure of anything remotely connected to scholastic progress. You just had to look at how institutions were behaving at this point in America to know how hollow the national core had become. that sense, New Orleans was almost the perfect metaphor in a way. To have the leader of what was once presumed to be the greatest and most powerful and richest nation on earth take his plane down to 8,000 feet and look out of the window of the plane. Not land, not go there like Lyndon Johnson had during Camille when he went to the Gulf and stood in a darkened room and by flashlight got on the radio and said, "I'm your president and I'm here." No, we had a president go down to 8,000 feet, look out the window and say, "It must be twice as bad on the ground." You can't imagine how that sounds to the ears of people who lived through Katrina in New Orleans. Just as, the next president, and if you think I'm playing sides, for the next president to go there for one day, shortly after his inauguration, stay for one day, and pronounce what happened to New Orleans as one of the greatest natural disasters the country had ever suffered. Calling Katrina a natural disaster anywhere near New Orleans, well, you'll get your head handed to you, and rightly so. It was not a natural, it was an engineering failure. The hurricane missed the city. It missed it by a significant margin. New Orleans was hit with a high Category 2 winds, and at 56 different places in the canal wall was breached. But if you think I'm being hyperbolic about the lack of American will, the fact that we no longer measure societal progress or who we are or how our society, the health of our society, by anything other than short-term profit. If you think I'm being cynical, let me take you a year out from Katrina to Hurricane Gustav, which also missed New Orleans, but not by much. And with the levees still under repair, with the canal wall still under repair, something happened in the industrial canal. For those of you that don't know the geography, and I realize I'm talking Tremaine out the wire, but it's all of a kind. For those of you that don't know the geography, about of the 2,000 some odd people who were killed in Katrina, good 900 of them died in the lower Ninth Ward when a barge struck the canal wall, shattered it, and a wave of water came rushing into the lower Ninth. During Gustav, a barge also came loose in the industrial canal, banged into the canal wall, came off anchor by the storm, and this time the wall held. And at that point, finally, somebody in the Coast Guard Safety Office said, I think from now on, when a hurricane's coming towards New Orleans, we're not going to leave any barges in the industrial canal. 900 dead. And, listen, there's nothing wrong with towing that barge 3 miles that way and putting it out in Pontchartrain, or 3 miles that way and putting it in the Mississippi River. So you have an earthen levee much higher than the canal walls, which were vulnerable. But you'd have to think about it. And you'd have to have the will to do it. You'd have to have the will to tell the barge companies, no, you can't leave it here. I don't care if it costs a little bit of extra to put it out on anchor there. Do it. Do it now. There's a hurricane coming. This is who we are. We have paid for this America, not for anything better. And if you look around and you say, how is it that we've ended up dealing with this level of mediocrity? How do we end up with these vast brownfields in West Baltimore? How do you end up with armored Humvees that third world countries figured out in the 1980s and the 1990s that if you put a V bottom on a military vehicle and you armor plate the bottom of it, the people inside will survive a explosive device if they run into a mine or an explosive device on the road. Not us. We sent why would we need to learn anything from anyone else? But besides that, it costs money. It costs money to put that armor plating down there. So you, as someone famously said, you go to war with the army you have. And you take the casualties you take. This is who we are. And the drug war to me, was this perfect Baltimore allegory for this failure of will, this unwillingness to look into the heart of our problems. If you think that the drug war is doing anything good, I challenge you to name me a corner that it's taken back in Baltimore. Since I was a police reporter, in 1982, I started covering that beat. Since I was a police reporter, I saw the corners multiply. I saw neighborhoods be devoured. I never saw a corner taken back for any length of time that mattered. I saw commanders plant the flag at one corner. I saw Tommy Frazier take back Green Mountain 21st. And then as he did so, Bond and Preston became the most out-of-control drug market in the city. You can push it. I haven't seen the purity of drugs decline. I've only seen it go up. You know, heroin's more pure than it was in '82, by far. Coke is more pure. I haven't seen the Dawn statistics, the drug-involved emergency room episodes go down dramatically. The addict population remains the addict population. Sometimes it's more violent. Sometimes it's more metabolite-based, more cocaine-based. Sometimes it's less violent. It's more heroin-based. You know, you get a 20% decline in your violence suddenly, and you get it all up and down the East Coast. It's probably not because every police commander and every mayor suddenly figured out how to police the drug war. It's pharmacological. Those are your trends. If the drug war were draconian and it worked, okay, we're going to be really cruel and we're going to throw away a lot of lives, and a lot of people are going to go to jail and a lot of families are going to be destroyed. But in a generation or two or three, it'll be gone. This threat will be gone. Our society will be healthier. But it doesn't work. It's just draconian and it doesn't work. How can I say that? Well, when I started as a police reporter, there were 500,000 people in American prisons. There's now 2.3 million. When I started as a police reporter, 34% of the federal prison population, for example, was violent offenders. Anyone want to guess what that figure is right now? 10, 15? You're an optimist. 7%. 7%. We're jailing more of our people for longer because we've eliminated parole. There is no federal parole. And there's so many more states that now do 3 strikes and out and life no parole on cases. We're jailing more of our people for longer, and they are less violent than at any other point in the history of our republic. We jail more people in raw numbers and in per capita percentage of our population than any totalitarian state you can name. Think about that for a moment. We jail more human beings than China. They've got 2 billion people. Somehow they're managing to keep less of their people in jail than we do. By numbers. I'm not talking percentages. By numbers. By percentages, we're a joke. We have 4% of the population in the world. We jail 25% of its inmates. The Republic is in jeopardy from this. And we tolerate it. Why do we tolerate it? Well, this would be my critique, and this was the Wire's critique of where we failed ourselves as a nation, is in this simple fundamental fact. We've measured ourselves by nothing other than the cash. We no longer believe that we share the same United States with the people on the other side of the Martin Luther King or the people on the other side of Gay Street. We no longer believe we occupy the same America. In fact, we're spending inordinate amounts of cash so that we don't occupy the same America. So that we live in a gated community and we have private police force that monitors the perimeter of our job sites, and then we have another private police force that sits in the little gatehouse of the community that we live out in the exurbs. We no longer believe we share the same future, and we don't. I mean, we're capable of enjoying that because we actually don't need 10 to 15% of our population. We don't have the factories. We don't have the manufacturing base. Those jobs by which people used to crawl into the middle class from the underclass in generations past They don't exist anymore. They're gone. And they're not coming back. So we don't need the underclass. What are we going to do with them? Well, good thing that there is one factory still working in places like West Baltimore and North Philadelphia, East St. Louis. Drug trade is there. It's hiring. It's hiring anybody who's willing to work hard. It's hiring anybody who's willing to not work so hard. It is the only person hiring. It is the only hiring man in these neighborhoods. We certainly didn't educate anybody in West Baltimore, East Baltimore, for the America that we were building somewhere else, for the economy that requires increasing complexity. We didn't pay for that. We didn't commit to that. We trained them for the corners. They know it. Their older brothers and sisters went to the corners. There was no jobs for them. You know, I mean, we're sitting in a city where 50% of the African American males are without work. 50%. That's the actual naturalized number of unemployment if you are African American and male and an adult in Baltimore City. That's not an economic system that works. That's not an America that we recognize. But it is an America. It's the other America. And we're willing to tolerate this, and we're especially willing to fight a war against the drug trade because there's some short-term profit in it. There's no long-term profit in it. We're all paying to hold 2.3 million of us in jail. We're all paying for this level of security state. We're paying for this level of interdiction. But we're willing to do it because it makes us feel a little bit better about where we've left our fellow Americans. We can not only, we not only no longer need to assess the fact that they're the economic victims of our transition to an alternate economy, we not only need to accept that, we can actually blame them. And we can make them, we can punish them. And we can become increasingly draconian with their lives. The drug war has become a war on the underclass in every sense. It doesn't work. It destroys people. And it's not making us any safer. It really isn't. Now, ultimately, we have to decide. If you're middle class, if you live in the suburbs, if you live in a neighborhood that has a healthy police presence, you need to decide what drug decriminalization might mean. What would it look like? Would my kid be more exposed to drugs? Well, anyone can get drugs who wants it in America. You know, my kids can get drugs if they want them. Your kids can get drugs if they want them. But it might be marginally easier if it was no longer a felony. There might be some sense of marginalization that exists now that wouldn't exist if we somehow changed our terms. On the other hand, that's part of being a society, of saying that before I turn the underclass, the people without prospect in my country, into just mere fodder for a criminal justice system that will chew them up and spit them out, I will accept those terms that my kids might be a little bit more at risk so that West Baltimore doesn't have to become a free fire zone where homicide is a matter of routine, where the police are basically in our army of occupation, where this war goes on that completely destroys everything else in the neighborhood. We would have to take it upon ourselves to endure slightly more risk. We would have to take it upon ourselves to endure slightly more risk in order for Mexico and the northern states of Mexico not to be an abattoir because of our demand for drugs. What we've done to Mexico, to our neighbor, is one of the most cowardly things that a country can do, which is to say, because we won't recognize the disaster of our own drug prohibition and what it's done and what it creates in terms of gangsterism and the fact that these cartels are now taking over the actual real estate of northern Mexico, so that we feel a little bit better about making drugs illegal and not placing ourselves at even slightly more moderate risk of having drugs intertwined with our world. We're willing to suffer 40, 50, 60, 100,000 deaths in Mexico. That's how many bodies they have. lying on the sidewalk in those Mexican states over the last few years. Think about that. Hundreds of thousands. They're coming up on 100,000 deaths from the drug wars in northern Mexico, so that we as Americans can continue to play this fraud out. You know, we're willing to fight the drug war to the last Mexican. That's how brave we are. We're willing to fight the drug war to the last inner city 14-year-old. Those are the casualties. By and large, those are the casualties. So that one of our kids, one of the haves in America, might not possibly be a casualty by the fact that we're now talking about drugs in medicalized terms rather than in terms of this sort of militaristic war of prohibition. So that might not happen. We're willing to consign whole populations to increasing levels of authoritarian brutality. It's embarrassing. I'm ashamed to be an American. I look at what's happening in Mexico and I'm ashamed. And I just want to apologize to them over and over again because it's our demand. If we didn't want it, if it wasn't trying to get in, if it wasn't our prohibition, if we came to terms with who we are and what we're doing in the world, we would stop. We would be ashamed. But everything about our political structure and everything about the way in which we go about even looking at our problems prevents us from doing that. The political system, in case you thought it could be reformed, well, the allegory in The Wire was what it was, which is to say, money is the mother's milk of politics. And we said that before Citizens United. You know, we couldn't have anticipated a decision that bad by the Supreme Court. That would have been like anticipating this generation's Dred Scott decision. But we did understand, just from a local reading of politics, that money is what sustains political careers. That's what the election cycle is about. It's about money. And so we made the money come when you say certain things and the money dry up when you stop saying certain things. Truth does not get you money in this environment. The idea that somebody at the Supreme Court thought for a moment that corporations are people is the one that that's the equivocation that everyone seized on and had a lot of fun with. And it is a lot of fun because it's a horrible equivocation. The idea that, but that's not the worst one in that ruling. The idea that the Supreme Court thought that money equaled speech, that's even uglier if you think about it. That money, you know, is look at what they've done to the American election. You know, if you're watching this horror show, and your government has been purchased. It was purchased before Citizens United. Now it's being purchased at a discount with greater effectiveness. What can you do? I don't know. I mean, you can think about throwing a brick because that's the only thing they understand at this point. You look at the Occupy movement. I obviously love the sentiment behind it, and I love the impulse, but it's clear they don't have a second act. It's clear they don't have a second act because the second act is resistance. Is to say, I'm not going to participate in this anymore. I'm not going to participate in the gamesmanship that says, you know, you will now, the game is rigged, we will play a rigged game, and because everybody has to trend towards the center at the end, because by and large Americans are generally reasonable people, and we're more to the center than we are anywhere else, because everyone has to trend to the center. Any actual solution of a problem that requires you to go left or right can't possibly happen. Socialized medicine? Medicine is socialized. For those of us that can afford it, what do you think health insurance is? What is group health insurance other than a socialistic principle? Think about it. We all believe in group medical plans, right? If you're lucky, you belong to one. I belong to one. You know, Writers Guild, thank God. That's socialized medicine. I can afford it. If I get sick, I can afford to have insurance because I'm in a shared group, a shared social group with the other 5,000, 6,000 writers in my union. So by the actuarial tables, if some of us get sick and some of us don't, we'll be all right. We'll be able to pass the risk around and we'll be able to afford it. guess what? That's socialism. But the idea of trying to actually do that for the country as a whole and make it so basic health care is affordable to everybody, and that, again, we all share the same future, look at what happened. Look at the money that came out to purchase your government and to make sure that that was maligned and misrepresented. And before long they were talking about death panels. I mean, think about it. Think about what money does. You're not looking at a Marxist up here. I've been mistaken for that routinely just by the fact that, I'm very critical of unrestrained capitalism. But capitalism is what we're left with. The 20th century decided that. And it decided it unequivocally. It's the only way to generate mass wealth for a society. So we're all going to be living in a capitalist world. But capitalism is not a blueprint for building a just society. It never has been. It's just an engine. It just makes money. How you distribute that money, how you make it so that all the classes have some degree of upward mobility, so that everyone has some sense of purpose and hope and future, how you use that money to solve all the attendant problems of your society, or to at least try to solve them, everything from the environment to job training, to anything that can improve the collective. Those are decisions that a government, a representative government, a responsible government, learns how to make as a matter of routine. We don't have that government anymore. It's been purchased and sold off to the highest bidder. So what can you do? You can start to say no. And I'm going to leave you with one thing, and we'll go to questions about how cool Omar was and why did you kill Stringer Bell. I'm going to leave you with one thing which you can all do. Right here is part of the jury pool for Baltimore City, for Baltimore County. If you still think, after all this, that putting more people in American prisons for nonviolent drug offenses is a meaningful response as a society and is a moral response, then, okay, I haven't reached you. And nothing that's happened in America over the last 30 years has reached you. But if you're starting to have doubts and you're picked for a jury, and you find yourself down at the courthouse, or maybe even in a district court if it's a petty drug case, and they ask you to sit on a nonviolent drug offense. I'm not talking about violence. Violence is violence. But nonviolent drug offense. I don't care if it's a pound of heroin or 2 gel caps. If they say guilty, not guilty, nullify that jury. Say you're not going to tinker with the drug war anymore. It's your absolute right as Americans, by the way. It's not illegal. Jury nullification goes back to the 17th century in America. It's part of our English common law. Look up the name John Peter Zenger if you don't believe me. It is an absolute American right. And at this point, it's an absolute necessity because no leadership on this issue is going to come from Washington. It's not going to come from the Democrats or the Republicans. There is no one who will maneuver anywhere from the center to do the right thing. There are conservatives who see that the drug war is a fraud. William Buckley was one of the first. If you think I'm kidding about that, there are liberals who clearly see it. And yet, nothing happens. Nothing happens because it has to be grassroots. It has to be us saying, I'm not going to participate in this anymore against my fellow Americans. I'm going to believe that my future is their future and that I cannot arrest my way out of this problem. I cannot make my underclass the chow for a prison industrial complex that is increasingly privatized and increasingly functioning by logic of Wall Street. A lot of these companies building prisons and jailing more and more nonviolent people in America every year are private companies. They trade on Wall Street, some of them. How do you think they go? What do you think they promise when they go to a Wall Street analyst who's looking at their sector and they say, I think over the next couple of years we can manage 6-7% increase in our profits? Because that's what you do with an analyst. You tell them that your sector is going to do well and your company is going to do well, and you want them to rate you highly. You want to attract investment. Well, the only way you can do that if you run a prison is by jailing 6 or 7% more people. That's what look at what if you think the drug war is not leading to incredible acts of cynicism, just wait. Whatever you think is not possible, they will do. They will do. So I would urge everyone at the end of this to really consider your options if you're made a juror in whatever jurisdiction you live in, and they bring a little shard of the American drug prohibition to you, and maybe do the right thing. I'll leave you with one last story, because I love this story, and it'll resonate for you Wire fans. You all know who Snoop is, right? Okay, you all know her history. I'm not going to go into it. She was locked up. A wiretap case. There was no overt act by her, but they said that she was trying to buy a package of heroin. She said, and again, I don't know what's true. Only she knows what's true. The government doesn't know what's true. I don't know what's true. She knows what's true. I don't know. But she says, look, I was definitely on the phone talking to him. Everybody I know, I'm from East Baltimore. Everybody I know is a drug dealer, a drug addict, an ex-drug dealer, or an ex-drug addict. It's like telling somebody who lived in Birmingham, Alabama in 1938, don't associate with steel workers. That's the factory. That's where we all came from. That's what we all did. Some of us are in it now. Some of us are out of it. I definitely had a conversation with them. They say I was asking for $30,000 back on a pack. I was asking for $30 because I lent him money for lunch. Is it true? Is it not true? All I know is this. She wanted to go to trial. She desperately wanted to go to trial. Her lawyer wanted her to go to trial. He knew and said to me, we can beat this. Okay, you want to go to trial. Well, how will that work? Let's say it's a wiretap case, which it is. That trial's not going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's not going to happen for 2 years. By the time they go through motions on a wiretap case and all the discovery, it's going to be 2 years. In those 2 years, we're not going to give you a bail. They didn't give her a bail. They said, you want to get out of prison, and oh, by the way, you not only want to get out of prison, you want to go to Philadelphia because you're filming something there. You actually got a job. We'll let you go to Philadelphia, but here's a card for a company out in Padonia, out in the county. It's a company that has a contract with Baltimore City. And this company will put an ankle bracelet on you, and they'll know where you are at all times, and that will be sufficient for the Baltimore Circuit Court to allow you out of jail. Otherwise, you're going to spend the next 2 years in women's detention. Okay? I'll wear the bracelet, no problem. I definitely want to go to trial. Okay, you can go to trial. Put the bracelet on. Oh, one other thing. The bracelet is $400 a week. $400 a week. Question, do I get that money back if I'm found innocent? No way. No way. If you don't think there's short-term profit, if you don't think people are getting rich and making salaries, people are getting rich off doing this to your fellow Americans. Now, all of us are getting poor. We're all paying that we're paying for that company's contract. We're paying for this level of pretrial detention. We're paying for this level of prosecution. We're paying for the interdiction. We're paying for everything. It's costing us. Just like the arguments over how much you're paying for a gallon of gas, can they get it down to $2.50? Think about that for a moment. Do you really think you're paying $2.50 for gas if they elect anyone, or $3.50 or $4.50? You're paying about $6.50 and $7.50 right now, you as Americans. How can I say that? Because it's not about the pump. Unlike the rest of Europe, which is paying $7 and $8 a gallon, you're paying it, but you're paying it in your taxes because you're paying it for an American military presence and for 2 wars that have gone on for close to a decade that are rooted in that part of the world. Our whole foreign policy dynamic is about keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and keeping American exceptionalism intact when it comes to cheap gasoline. Rather than just be like the rest of the world and say to ourselves, how much do you want for a barrel of oil? What's the market? What will the market bear? Those are terms that we can't accept. So we fought Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Afghanistan. We're embroiled over there for a variety of reasons, but one of them is for the artifice of saying we only pay $3.50 a gallon, while the rest of Europe pays more. That's who we are. So don't think you're not paying for the drug war in the same way. But, somebody's getting rich. If you can get on the right side of this thing, you'll get paid. And that company, when I tried to reach that company on the phone to ask them, what's the $400 a week for? Nobody would answer a question. Nor did they feel they had to. Wait, it's state money? You're on a state contract. Shouldn't you have to, what do you guys do? No. Call back, talk to my boss, and then nobody picks up the phone. So she eventually pled guilty. And she got 8 years suspended. Now, by the way, if they think you're really going to buy $30,000 worth of heroin and they give you a suspended sentence, it means they didn't have a good case. But they got a conviction. And they managed to avoid the embarrassment of going to court on a high-profile case and losing by basically making her bail situation untenable. If you don't think the drug war will lead your government to malign your rights in new and profound ways, the longer it goes on, I don't know what to tell you after the last 30 years. But we are less free than ever before, and we're less safe from drugs than ever before. And the only thing we've managed to do is brutalize our underclass. So that's my big spiel, and I can't resist turning every speaking engagement into an argument against the drug war because it's about the only thing that I think might come out of the wire that might have any real permanence. I guess right now, having ranted and raved, there's nothing left to do but just do questions. Yeah. In the front. I'm sorry. You next.
Says that the job of the scriptwriter is not to tell the audience what just happened, but to make them wonder what will happen next. Can you share some of the techniques about scriptwriting and storytelling that you found valuable or that you created?
Oh, I didn't create anything. I mean, we're just, every story's been written. You're just trying to plug in new moments and new worlds and new characters into stuff that somebody else already got to before you. Tricks of writing. Well, there is something that we did in the early episodes which makes you believe almost anything. And I gave it a name one time in the writer's room and they all laughed at me, but I called it random quotidian. Which is to say, we all know that a story, somebody very smart said that life is, or drama is life with the boring parts taken out. And that's very true. You need to, every line needs to justify itself, every scene needs to justify itself. But sometimes the justification for some of the stuff we did on The Wire and in The Corner and and especially in Generation Kill was to absolutely create an environment that you believed contained real people and was a real environment. And by that I mean, you don't want to see police officers do their daily run sheet and fill out all their paperwork and argue over who's going to get the shitty vehicle and fill up their day with what they actually fill up their day with. Or see, for that matter, recon Marines argue about the grooming standard and the sergeant major enforcing the grooming standard in the middle of a war zone. But that's what they spend their time arguing about. They're not there to first of all, there was no constant combat in Iraq. It was, it was moments of sheer adrenaline and terror, followed by a lot of sitting around and bitching and moaning. That's what the military is. Well, some of that stuff is hilarious because everyone's funny about their own jobs. Marines are funny about being Marines, and drug dealers are funny about being drug dealers. There's humor in every workplace. And some of it is interesting just because it's so obscure. And some of it just is. And if you put enough of it, especially in your early episodes, if you put enough debate so that you have a bunch of Marines sitting around the tent and they're talking about, the one Marine who's like, whose body is unbelievably cut because he's been lifting weights like crazy, And they talk about, like, if we can only get Rudy to make gay porn, which they did. That's what they talked. You know, it's like, Rudy, you know, if we can get Rudy, we can make $1 million. And they would sit around the tent, like, arguing with each other about how they were going to get Rudy to make gay porn. So let's put that in. And then as you do that, you know, you're looking at it and you say, okay, now this guy shows up and that guy, and somebody says this about him being Mexican. Oh, you know, Evan Wright, because we were writing with Evan, who is the embedded journalist in that story. Evan jumps out of his seat and goes, use this. I remember Manimal one time said, you know, Puerto Ricans are just tropical Mexicans, you know? And now you're into levels of Marine speak, because that's how they speak. I mean, you know, Marines go out of their way to be offensive to the rest of the world and to each other. And Marines embraced it. A lot of people thought in the beginning of Generation Kill that the Marines had a racial problem in the unit. They had no racial problems. They vocalized every racist sentiment they had in every possible direction. And it's undercut by the fact that there's incredible unit solidarity. And yet, we felt no need to explain this. We just did it. But it felt real. And that business of, like, none of this has to do with why we're in Iraq. None of this has to do with what went right in the war, what went wrong with the war. None of this has to do with their mission. It has to do with making the world believable. And so a lot of the stuff that was just sort of funny talk of sitting around the squad room in The Wire, you know, lay off the Greeks, they invented civilization, you know, other stuff like that. That's just cops being cops. And now you're ready to believe stuff like they invented Amsterdam, because you've laid that groundwork. And a lot of drama doesn't bother with that stuff. They want to get right to the car chase. They want to get right to the gunfight. They want to get right to the issue. This is why people generally refer to The Wire as a slow starter, and Treme as a slow starter, and Generation Kill as a slow starter. I promise you, they're all slow starters. You know, it's, you know, any book you ever cared about. Again, and like I say, I don't know how to make good television. I only know how to make what we do. I'm not comparing us to something this good, but Moby Dick, right? First chapter, you don't meet the whale, you don't meet Ahab, you don't go on the Pequod. You know, he's looking for a room, and the rooms are all taken up, and he ends up having to share a room with this guy with a lot of tattoos and weird guy, and then he goes to a church, and the guy's speaking in all these shipping and whaling metaphors for his sermon, and you know, it's like chapter 4 before he even goes on the deck of the ship. No white whale yet. You know, well, that story, don't tell me what Moby Dick isn't a story well told. It is. It's a great story. And it's done beautifully, and you know, with the exception of that one naturalism whale chapter, which could go, it's pretty perfect. But it's slow. It starts slow. But you have faith when you open it up. Well, it's Moby Dick. Everyone says it's a good book. I'll read it. Nobody quits, you know, because they get to the because Queequeg is weird and because he has to share a bed with him, and you know, I don't know where this is going. God damn. But that's generally the reviews that we got season 1 of The Wire, and it's the reviews that we get on Treme, and you know, and everyone's going to say, you know, Treme, it's not The Wire, you know, and whatever it isn't The Wire, but whatever it is, you won't know it until we're done, and until you see what we've built and whether it was worth the building. And that's an open question. Some people will see it and say, you know, but again, I'm interested in the whole. I'm interested in, so all that stuff that's groundwork really matters. And it's not to be trifled with, it's to be done well if you can do it well. Did that help? Okay. All right, go forth and write something. Yeah. I was just going to say Homicide wasn't mine, but it was my book, and I learned how to write on it, but I don't want to take credit for other people's work. It's a very good show, and I was very proud to work on it, but I was a carpenter nailing other guys' boards in, and happy to do it.
I stand corrected. However, they all seem to have this incredible degree of realism that you don't see in a lot of other shows, and one of the things that is particularly gratifying to me is the portrayal of African Americans as multidimensional people, and the
I actually saw a lot of it in the police department. I mean, I saw a lot of it. I saw a lot of salt and pepper partnerships in the police department. And they went back into the 70s, and they were very close. And you see that with the Marines as well, although the Marine unit that we were actually depicting only had one African American in the platoon. That's just what it was. You know, it was a recon unit that was heavily Latino. But there are places where you don't see that, and where you see, I think, a greater degree of strain. I would say the newsroom of the Baltimore Sun when I was there. For a paper that was covering a majority black city, it was amazing how poorly the Sun addressed itself to hiring black reporters and editors, or nurturing them, or keeping them, because, of course, you get anybody who's very good, and they were much sought after by the industry, so you're going to have to pay them a little extra to keep them, or they're going to go to the Post or the Times. And the Sun was unwilling to do that. But the other thing that I saw at the Sun that was really telling to me was, I think we're getting healthier as a country in this way. Look, Obama is Obama, and he is the president. That's a sign. I didn't expect to see that in my lifetime. But we all want, and Andrew Hacker, if you've read the book Two Nations, Andrew Hacker got to the bottom of this. We all now want, not by all I mean 70, 80% of the country wants to live in an integrationist model. We all want to live in a neighborhood where our kids can experience a certain amount of multiculturalism, where they don't grow up in a vacuum, where they're not uncomfortable if they walk into a room and they're white, but now they're a minority. You know, you want your kid to experience a better human ideal, and that's changing in America, and it's changing for the better. On the other hand, they've actually done studies where when a neighborhood goes from 7 or 8% African American to 12 to 15%, it flips. That's we all want a little of it. We want it to just be just the right amount, and that's the nature of America even today. And what I found at the Baltimore Sun was they wanted desperately to be working with African American reporters and editors, but they also wanted the African American reporters and editors to think and to agree with them. They didn't want the argument. So when a guy was persistently making arguments about the nature of coverage, or the nature of, or speaking on behalf of a point of view that was distinctly in opposition to what the white editors felt, and I'm speaking about a newspaper going back into the 90s now, so it's a long time, but that was not. It was like, it's not. It wasn't about. It was, it's not about you being black. It's about not thinking like us. And again, I love the argument. I love arguing. And the most secure people that I worked with were capable of arguing. And they were capable of interracial arguments, even about race. Those were the reporters that gravitated to each other in the newsroom. And the ones that didn't that felt uncomfortable, that got freaked out when they were yelling at a black guy and a black guy was yelling back at them, they avoided those arguments. Consequently, they avoided those stories. And the stories never got written because they never got argued about. So I think, in every institution you find the people who are comfortable. And then you find the ones who are not. And they're usually on different tracks. But in the Baltimore Police Department, I mean, if you read the book Homicide, you'll come to, Burns and Edgerton, Eddie Brown and Dave Brown. These guys who were partnered up and could do great work together. Donald Warden worked for 12, 13 years with Ron Grady in robbery. Somehow, those jobs where the rubber hits the road, like the military or paramilitary police department, those things fall away quicker than maybe in the rest of society. You can download it illegally. No, see, I made you all clap, but I really hate that. Because, it costs a lot of money to make a season at Treme. And we're right on the bubble of being able to finish because of all the people clapping for illegal downloads. Yeah, I saw you. I saw. Yeah.
But anyway, great. I wanted to know if you could comment a little on why you chose to make the. So most of the characters in The Wire are either desperate for the underclass, as you put it, or working steps, I would say. There's a few exceptions, obviously, but and most of the characters on Treme seem to be of the creative class. You've got a professor, you've got a lawyer, and then you've got professionals, and then you've got a lot of musicians and Marty Grandy and of various levels of.
It's a different story.
It's a different story, and it seems that most of them, their problems come in with Katrina. Not that they had no problems before, but that Katrina is where their life gets.
Well, no, Katrina's a baseline, but I agree with you. We're using it as a baseline.
So is there a reason why, maybe it's changed with the later seasons, I don't know, but is there, I lived in New Orleans for summer, there are large numbers of extremely poor people there. Is there a reason why the show is primarily about them?
The show actually does have some people who have very little money, but ultimately, only a fool would make the same story twice, or a person who didn't think time was precious. The Wire took me 8 years to make. It's 8 years where I didn't make something else. Treme is going to take, if I get my chance to finish it, it'll take 5 years. It's 5 years where I didn't get to make something else. The idea that I was going to go to New Orleans and make another show about the dynamics of inner city poverty, again, after The Corner and The Wire, that would be a fool's errand for me. I was interested in something else, and we were after a different game in that hunt, which is this. A lot of people watched The Wire, and if they weren't from Baltimore, I think, took it to heart very easily. Certain little details, Baltimore got very affectionate with The Wire very quickly. The rest of the country, it took a little longer, and for some people, usually the same bunch of people who haven't been downtown in their own cities for 30 years, since Brown versus the Board of Education, you started to hear comments like, well, if Baltimore's that much of a hellhole, why don't they move? Or there's no saving that city. Well, I still live in Baltimore, and I don't believe that, and I never believed that, and if I believed that, there would be no reason to do the show. To me, the value of the American city is implied in that is our future. We're either going to figure it out and succeed as a society, or we're not. We're going to fail. And it's why I found back in 2008, the last round of Republican meanderings, their last convention, where they were talking about the real Americans and real American values and small town values. And I'm from where the real Americans live. Fuck it, I'm from Baltimore. I live around real Americans. It's not small town values that's going to save us. 86% of us now, 84%, something like that, live in greater metro areas, either cities or suburbs that are oriented to cities. That's living a multicultural life and having that dynamic become vibrant and creative and maintain itself is of issue. That's a real issue. Small town values can't help us. Big city values can help us. That's what we have to learn. And ultimately, why New Orleans is interesting to me is that it was a city that suffered a near-death experience. And then, if you watch to see what made it come back, it wasn't political fiat. There was no political leadership on the state, federal, or local level. Leadership was a disaster. It certainly wasn't that they got a handle on providing services, because New Orleans is one of the, if you live there, it's one of the worst served cities. Everything from the condition of the streets to the condition of the police department. It's one of the worst police departments in America. It's one of the worst school systems in America by far. Nothing works in New Orleans except the culture. The culture brought the city back. And what is the culture but an absolute triumph of American multiculturalism? It's given the world the greatest gift that America will ever give. If we're wiped off the face of the earth today, and America is just a memory in the world's eyes, the one thing that will sustain us culturally as having been relevant is African American music. There's nothing else that's close. You don't have to applaud, it just is. It just is. I mean, you go to any jukebox anywhere in the world, and if they're not playing Duke Ellington, they're playing Otis Redding, they're playing Michael Jackson, they're playing Tupac. It's the gift that keeps on giving all over the world. Now, what else? You got anything to rival it that we've given the world? Baseball? No. It hasn't really permeated anywhere but the Pacific Rim and Latin America. Constitutional democracy? We've exported a lot less of that than we like to believe. What? Film? American film? No, the Germans invented that. Obesity. Nice. Nice. But you know what? I can't defend New Orleans on that score either. Not with everything down there that's fried. This is, and it all came from an 8 square block area of New Orleans, and it couldn't have happened without the peculiarities of American history, of the slave trade, of the dynamics of the French planters allowing Congo Square to exist, for those that know the history of jazz, for the African pentatonic blues scale, flatted thirds and flatted sevenths from West Africa, and African rhythm mixing with European instrumentation and arrangement. That only happened in New Orleans. It couldn't have happened, film would have gone on anywhere. I mean, Hollywood is Hollywood because we're better at it, and at marketing it than a lot of other people. But there's film cultures all across the globe. And if Hollywood didn't exist, something else would be preeminent. But this couldn't have been invented by anything other than Americans. And by Americans, I mean the collective, the immigrant collective of everybody throwing in. It's a magnificent triumph of the city, of the American city. So for me, Treme is this allegory. That's what it is. It's an allegory that argues for the city. It's the obverse of what The Wire was saying, or the reverse of what The Wire was saying, which is not only does the city matter, but what we could be as a community and as a culture if we got past this sense of we're only in it for ourselves, or that profit is a means of measuring a society. This is embarrassing to say, but I think Treme might be the most patriotic thing I ever work on. But in a very real sense, it is. It's what I find to be most inspiring about being an American. Yeah.
So the first season of The Wire seems to be about comparing the police department to the drug trade. And then you saw a lot of time with the book. I was wondering which organization did it better run, more effective?
Well, they were both well run in certain ways, and they were both poorly run in other ways. The police department probably values its human resources better than the drug trade by far. They do. There's a pension plan, when a police officer is killed in the line of duty, it's a moment of profound respect, and they take care of their own. And the drug trade is all about discarding human beings. So, I mean, there's really no comparison at that point. The drug trade has its efficiencies that are, it's an economic model and it has its efficiencies, but it's not by the fact that anybody's really great at running it and that good managerial skills win out. It's the fact that we've made it illegal so that their margins of profit are so, you can afford an incredible amount of latitude when it comes to spillage and loss and, missing packages and miscalculation, and still make an egregious amount of profit as a drug dealer. By the way, at the height of being a drug dealer, on the corners, where the margins are much less, the average guy you see standing out there on one of these corners is not making very much money at all, and because most of them have fallen into the product by about age 19 on. They're working for, you know, a shot in the morning, a shot at night, a couple of speedballs, and maybe $40, $50, $60 to be a tout or you know, or a runner or, you know, lookout. I mean, it's, you know, it's, again, when human beings, when capital triumphs, human beings are worth less. Labor is a cost. And if at some point you don't mitigate against that, you know, what do they need? They need a union. We all need a union. The decline of union labor in America and around the globe means that all of us every day are worth a lot less. And that's true of, and that was true throughout the wire, of from the imported sex workers to the kids on the corner. You know, I believe in union. Trade unionism is what made this country great. Not because they won every fight. You know, management needs to win what they need to win, and you need to find the margins. But trade unionism allowed for poor people to become a middle class that was the greatest consumer class the world had ever seen. And now we can't find enough people to buy all the crap we make, whether they need it or not, to sustain us, because we've eviscerated the middle class. But the origins of that, you know, read your history. It goes back to trade unionism. The idea that labor is not simply a cost. Labor is also society. And it's the people who you're going to need to buy your products and need to have disposable income. And we've destroyed that. And we found a way to have contempt for it. I'm amazed, but that's where we are. Yeah.
So a lot of the wire was about, like a couple thought experiments, like Amsterdam and trying to see, like, what if scenario is it, or what is the scenario?
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about, in the wire, decriminalizing drugs at like a state or national level to see what happens?
What do you mean?
Like, was there any thought about creating a storyline in which, like, the drug war was all off?
Oh my God, I thought it was hyperbolic enough to have some small shard of the Western District declared a free zone. You know, I don't know how I could make things come out of characters' mouths who are in leadership positions that would be, you know, just to have the mayor looking at a 14% decline in crime in the Western District and agonizing about, is there any way I can possibly keep this by calling it another name for 24 hours, for a 24-hour window before it hits the press, at which point he walks sideways from the whole. I thought that was hyperbolic. It ain't happening. It's only happening if we, ordinary Americans, say, I'm not playing this game anymore. And I'm not playing it with the lives of my fellow Americans. I don't care if they look different from me or have less money than me or live in another part of America. I'm not playing. What was Justice Blackmun's line about I'll no longer tinker with the machinery of death, when he was talking about no longer accepting, no longer trying to mitigate the problems of the death penalty? Well, I feel the same way about the drug prohibition. I'll no longer tinker with it. I will not participate. I will not, you know. I understand. Everyone from One America looks on the stop snitching impulse in the inner city as being self-defeating and cynical. I see it as being something almost essential. I see it as being the last stand of people whose neighborhoods have been turned into war zones, who look upon the police as being, you know, it's Soweto before the change. It's Gaza. It's an army of occupation. And I just can't say it enough. It's done such damage, and it hasn't solved anything. It hasn't made drugs less plentiful, less pure. All it's done is given us the largest prison population that the world has ever seen, and made us all less free. So, you know, I don't see anybody but us responding to it, and that's how Prohibition ended. A lot of people think Prohibition ended because the politicians got wise to all the gangsterism that resulted, and that people just didn't want it. And one of the fundamental things that ended Prohibition, if you know the history, is they couldn't find 12 Americans to put a 13th in jail for making bathtub gin. That was it. They couldn't. They started in places like Ohio and Indiana and Missouri. They couldn't impanel juries, and that was the beginning of the end for Prohibition for Volstead. So that has to happen for the drug war. And it has to happen because we say, I'm not willing to make my life that much more safe and my kids that much more safe if it's doing this to the childhood that we're seeing in West Baltimore, East Baltimore, or in Matamoros, Mexico. You know, if it's turning those places into free fire zone and abattoirs, then you know I'm not willing to pay that price with their lives, and we're all in it together. Again, it's the idea of the communal, of shared risk and shared responsibility. We'll do a couple more because we're late, and I've been promised a beer at the down here. There's a lot of projects on the board. They're really not worth talking about unless they get greenlit. You know, I got a couple of series projects that I've thrown out to HBO, and I've got a couple of miniseries things for the miniseries division. And whether they have the money, you know, at some point they're going to get wise to me. They're going to realize, you know, he makes these shows and nobody watches them. And I'm serious. And there's a lot of A-list directors at HBO now. And there's only so much pie to go around. And at some point, they're just going to look at me and go, it's been a great run. And, you know, I'll probably end up going back to prose. I owe a book to an editor, and, you know, he keeps waiting for my career to bottom out at HBO, and I keep waiting for it too. It's been a very improbable run. But, you know, it'll be rooted in something real. I will not make science fiction. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. You know, it won't be a romantic comedy. You know. What? Oh, I can talk about that. Bill Zorzi and I have been working for years gathering string on the rise of the drug trade in Baltimore in the 50s and 60s into the 70s. About when it went from being sort of this back alley jazz man's kind of vice to being a market, a full-blown market, and about how that happened and sort of the economic allegory of it. And so we've been trying to interview the guys who are still alive on both sides about how the disaster got started, the drug war, and how it blew up. And really the origins of it go back to the early 50s. Policy-wise, drugs go back further than that, but the beginning of the systemic reaction to it. So a lot of these guys are dying now. And some of them are talking to us and some of them are not. But a lot of the guys who were the real pioneers of the drug trade and a lot of the pioneers of the drug prohibition from the police side are in their 80s and 90s. You know, sometimes they talk and sometimes they're really helpful and sometimes they're very honest and sometimes they tell us to go fuck ourselves. There's a guy, Snyder Blanchard, nicknamed Japan, who goes back to the 40s. And he was in his 90s. And Bill Zorzi tried to work him. And Bill Zorzi is a charmer. I don't know if you know him, but he tried to work him 3 or 4 times. And finally, you know, Japan told him, you know, I am not talking to any reporters about what I did in my life. You know, go away. And he died recently. And so it's a fundamental loss for Baltimore that, you know, for that the history that guy took with him to the grave is just remarkable. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you about the use of space in the water, space in the city. You've got the corners, you've got the courtyards, you've got the stair towers and the high rises. And even a story you just told about Snoop, you know, it just makes me think about spatial control as a tool of social control. And is that, I was wondering if that was a conscious thread in the writer's room with you all, or is that just emerged from how you have to tell the story?
It emerges from how to tell the stories. That said, again, I don't know if this happens in a lot of writers' rooms, but we try to read what there is to read about the issues before we start arguing. And it's like, again, it goes back to, you know, for example, I don't know how many people know this, but the patterns of segregation that are endemic to northern industrial cities, Baltimore included, have their origins as far back as the New Deal in the 1930s. And the way in which publicly funded mortgage programs, which came up under Roosevelt as a means of advancing home ownership during the Depression, were absolutely redlined. If you were African American, you could not get a government-backed mortgage in a white neighborhood. So the patterns of segregated housing until blockbusting came about in the 50s in this city or any city. You go to Chicago, all those high-rise projects on the Dan Ryan, Robert Taylor Homes, all packed in against the lake on one side of the Dan Ryan Expressway. That's a plan. That didn't just happen by accident. Well, now you got me talking about another project, but I'm working on something about Yonkers, which is Yonkers, New York is one of the places where they had the first successful suit of a city by the Justice Department for having taken all the federal housing money and having put all the low-income housing in one small quadrant of Yonkers, having stacked it up on itself, and leaving absolutely no public housing on the other side of, say, the Sawmill Expressway, which bisects Yonkers. And a judge in New York back in the 80s came in and said to Yonkers, come on, this got to end. I find you in violation of civil rights. You spent this money in such a way as to increase the segregation of your city, purposely. Put up 200 units of scattered site housing on the other side of the Sawmill Expressway. Yonkers exploded for 15 years in one of the most, it was a 15-year slow motion race riot that finally, the mayor killed himself. The mayor, the youngest mayor in America, put a gun to his head finally because of the city bankrupted itself at one point. It came close to bankrupting itself in contempt citations because councilmen were refusing, acting as if to actually do this, to actually put public housing was the end of the world as we know it. Even scattered site, even not high rise, not the mistakes of the past, but even just 200 scatter site units in an area of 80,000 other residents, 200 units. So the city nearly destroyed itself. That's so, and they just had the settlement in Yonkers, I think, in the last couple of years. So housing patterns and, this stuff is all part of the history of urban America. And it's how we failed to come to terms with one of the great migrations in our society, which was rural and southern African Americans coming, to the northern cities in the early part of the 20th century, in the middle part of the 20th century. We were very good at swallowing immigrant class after immigrant class and moving them out of places like the Lower East Side and out of West Baltimore and into the Levittowns of America. But when it came to African Americans, suddenly that democratized machine that would make every immigrant class into democratic voters as fast as a generation, somehow we choked on that. And we're dealing with the consequences now, 50, 60 years later, in terms of, drive around West Baltimore, East Baltimore nowadays and see all the vacant lots and all the dead real estate. The only thing they could think to do after a while was to destroy the village in order to save it. So, one last question. Sorry if you're in the back and my field of vision is pathetic.
I wanted to say why it was an amazing project to work on, and I'm sure everyone involved.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to see if any of your possible future projects involved.
Some do, yeah. Sorry, Baltimore can't double for New Orleans. And it can't double for Iraq yet. No, I would love to come back. It was a great film crew, great film community. I'll put in another word for something else, which is that when we left, it finished about 20 years of building up the film community in this city, which I had no part in. I wrote Homicide, but the real origins came first with John Waters and his early movies, and then really with Barry Levinson coming to town. And it happened to be my book, but I had nothing to do with it. It was Barry Levinson and Tom Fontana really started to grow the film community here, so that by the time The Wire finished its run, we could film not only an existing TV show, and it's the TV shows because of the long film time, 10, 12 episodes, whatever, 150, 200 days. Now you can really sustain people in full-time positions while you're waiting for movies to come in and out of town for 40, 60-day shoots. But by the end of The Wire's run, we were shooting, there could be 3 major productions in town simultaneously. We had enough crew base to do it. I somehow, I don't know, somehow whatever charm I managed to bring to all my other human endeavors, I failed to bring to my relationship with Martin O'Malley, because he so hated the show that they did a very foolish thing, which was, although Maryland had a very modest film tax give-back thing, which, again, you're giving back. It's a tax rebate based on the commitment to spend X amount of money in the city. I mean, it's literally like, I'm giving you $1, hand me a quarter back, but I got to give you the $1 first in terms of economic. I'm absolutely going to spend this money in Maryland. Here it is. Give me a quarter back. Now, does the film industry as a whole need give backs like this? No, they don't. It's like stadiums, and I hate that they've put a gun to every state's head and said, if you want a film industry. But once one state does it, once Connecticut and Michigan and Louisiana do it, then the race is on. You can't give up so much that you're never going to get it back. But Maryland, for whatever reason, Governor O'Malley got very petulant. And I don't know why, but he basically let the program die. And for about 2-3 years, you had no production in Maryland, and most of the people moved out. And now when I walk out of a building down on Britannia Street, that's sort of the film building where we all lease office space, I'm walking into, not even working on Tremay, but on the movies that are down in Louisiana. Louisiana's their film work is in the billions now. Billions. I mean, Maryland hit like 250 million one year. That was their height. New Orleans went over $1 billion. I mean, I'm sorry, Louisiana went over $1 billion. And I walk out of my office now, and here's my prop master from Homicide. Here's here's the key grip who worked on The Wire. They're all working on movies down there, and they've moved their families. So some of them are still here, and some of them want to come back. And they've just the state finally this year reinstituted the beginnings of a program. But you're behind the other. And again, it's not my money. I'm paid by salary. I'm not arguing for more profit for me. I get paid by a salary to make the movie. The studios say you can make this movie for $24 million with the givebacks in Pennsylvania, or you can make it for $28 million in Maryland. Make it in Pennsylvania. It's money routing itself. I wish they could almost pass a law that said no state can do this, no givebacks, screw the film industry, you guys make enough money, because I agree with that. Unfortunately, you can't pass a law like that because it's against the Commerce Clause. And so it happens. So Maryland doesn't need to have a film industry, but if you want to have one, you're going to have to figure out how to live in the real world. And they didn't figure it out for about 3 or 4 years. And it was really sad to watch it fall apart, because crew base is what it's about, is being able to come into a town and pick up crew and have the crew know their business. And Maryland had a 20-year run. I didn't get in the way of it, and I helped it a little bit, but it was really Barry and Tom and John Waters who deserve all the credit. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And thank you to Mica.